is Joyce Raimondo, and I'm here in the Springs, East Hampton, Long Island. It's a spectacular sunny day. And behind me is the barn where Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner created their famous abstract expressionist works. So today we have a special program. We are going to explore the relationship between Pollock and Clifford Still. And we're going to go on a little virtual road trip to Colorado to visit the Clyfford Still Museum. And we're going to get a presentation by Kendra Keenan, one of the educators at the museum. So I'm so happy that Kendra and I can do this together and share this experience on Zoom today. So I'm going to head back over to the barn. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce Kendra, and then we're going to come back to the barn so I could show you around. And then Kendra will continue after that, and we'll have time for questions. What is the remarkable story behind these two amazing artists? I really didn't realize until recently how Pollock's death in his car accident in 1956 was linked in any way to Clifford Still. So Kendra will tell us a little bit about that story, and then we'll continue on the tour.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. Hi, my name is Kendra Keenan. As Joyce said, I am here in Denver. And so we'll get a chance to check out the Clyfford Still Museum a little bit after we hear a bit about Pollock. But the story of how these two artists are connected is really interesting. And just to get us started, Pollock was big into road trips. Well, Pollock, like road trips, Still was really into cars and road trips. And it was something that they did share in common. They were artists that were talking to each other, sharing ideas, part of the same social circles, artistic circles. And it turns out that Still had made a visit to Pollock's house in East Hampton one night when Pollock, as Still described it, was pretty drunk, roaring drunk, he put it. And Still was about to make this trip out to Spokane, Washington, which is part of where he grew up. So he's about to drive across the country, and he invites Pollock to come along with him. The plan was to take separate cars, and they were going to meet up at different points along the way regularly. And their first meetup was supposed to be in Pennsylvania. Pollock didn't show, and then Still didn't realize until a few days later that Pollock had died when he saw his obituary in the newspaper. And so that was how Still found out that that Pollock had passed, and they were not going to be seeing each other on this road trip. And Still thought a lot about it. It was a thing that had an effect on him. He even thought that had Pollock gone on the road trip, that maybe he might have still been alive. And of course, we'll never know, but it was something that Still did remark on in an interview and talk about with other people. So they did have this connection, and I'm excited to share a little more about Still and hear about Pollock as well today. So thanks, Joyce.
Thank you. Good. So some of you have been to the Pollock, our Zoom tours before, and some of you I see are artists in your own right, and some are beginners. So I'm going to just start with a very broad overview of the connection between Clifford Still and Pollock and the abstract expressionist. And I'm going to do a brief screen share for that. So Jackson Pollock, of course, is best noted for his drip paintings, and very radical in the 1950s. Pollock is making these expansive canvases, 100% abstract art. And rather than even using a brush to adhere the paint to the canvas, he's dripping house paint from sticks. So it's not only radical in the approach of abstraction, but in the methodology as well. So, and I'm going to take you into the studio in a moment where we actually have some of the paints that Jackson Pollock used. This is called action painting, because Pollock is in action as he's making his drip paintings. He's moving, and as you can see, his movement is recorded in the final work. And the final work of art really conveys the movement and the action of the artist, right? So you can clearly see the artist's mark. Lee Krasner is also known as an action painter, but she didn't drip paint like Pollock. Her technique was to use a brush. Sometimes she would do a little dripping. And this is one of her famous methods where she would rip up her old canvases or cut them up, adhere them onto a new work of art, and then paint back into it to create a completely new composition. This is also action painting because you can see the movement. It's very active. You can imagine her ripping and tearing. It's really a very physical release of energy. So within these abstract expressionists, there was the group, so to speak, like de Kooning, Pollock, Krasner, and others, where the canvases are very full and charged with gesture, okay? But then you have the other side of abstract expressionism, which is color field painting, like this one by Mark Rothko. It's very still, it's contemplative, it's meditative. And this one by Barnett Newman. And this one by Clifford Still. So we're going to expand our idea today of what is abstract expressionism. And I can't wait to learn alongside everyone on this Zoom, because Clifford Still, unlike Pollock, is not a household name. He's not as noted in the history books typically. So we're going to give Clifford Still his credit, so to speak, today and highlight him through Kendra. And I can't wait to learn more about this amazing painter. And Kendra will tell us a little bit more about some of the reasons maybe Clifford Still is not as known as Pollock. So I want to take you into the barn. And some of you live around here. I'm sure you've been here. And the highlight, of course, is Pollock's drip painted floor. This is not a work of art. This is where the accidental spills and splatters landed as he was walking around his paintings and dripping paint. This is a national landmark. And we have historic photos. You can come back another day for the full tour. This is by Hans Namath, and it shows Pollock's famous technique, right? He's dripping the paint. He's not even touching the painting as he's working. He's working all four sides. Now, Pollock, similar to Clifford Still, he grew up in the West. He was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1912. And then his family moved to California and Arizona. His dad was a land surveyor. And Pollock had some influences from being out West. One of them was the methodology that the indigenous people used to paint, the dripping down of sand onto the surface of the floor to create an image, okay? Pollock actually saw that at the Museum of Modern Art. But very early on, he was interested in Native American art. And also, Pollock, like Clifford Still, perhaps there was in his memory this idea of this expansive American landscape, right? From growing out West. And I think his canvases reflect that. So Pollock was using non-traditional materials for his drip painting. These are the house paints that Pollock used. He was also squirting paint at times from basters, using the stirrer as a tool to drip paint, and sometimes using the brush to drip paint. Now, Pollock arrived at this after many, many years of study. And we do have some Zoom talks where I go in a little more detail into the influences on Pollock, how he arrived at this technique. Okay, but we're not going to focus on that today. So after Pollock's death in 1956, as Kendra mentioned, it was really tragic. Pollock was an alcoholic, and he was sober for 2 years when he made his best paintings, and everything was going really well for Pollock. He had everything I think an artist could want. I mean, he had a house right here in the Springs on the east end of Long Island, in one of the most spectacular locations. His wife, Lee Krasner, was a painter. and she managed Pollock's career. She put her own career on the back burner so that he would become the primary breadwinner. She always painted, though. She negotiated with Peggy Guggenheim so that they could have the money for the down payment on, on loan for the house. Pollock had a monthly stipend from Peggy Guggenheim, which Lee negotiated. So he didn't have to worry about selling his paintings or working at a job. And they had 2 dogs. And here he's pictured with his pet crow. And it's really the story of the American dream, right? He comes from very humble beginnings and he rises to fame. He's making a very good living. And here he is in the media, Life magazine. Is he the greatest living painter in the United States? But sadly, Pollock was battling alcoholism. And he sought psychiatric help, which really helped him. And he started drinking again, and he became so depressed. Towards the end of his life, he was barely painting. And this story breaks my heart because he died when he was 44 years old. He succumbed to alcoholism. There was nothing creative about being an alcoholic. It destroyed his creativity and his life. And in the car that day, Pollock invited his mistress. He also started to have a marital affair. Lee Krasner had gone to Paris to get a break. And Pollock at that time invited Ruth Kligman, his mistress, who invited her friend Edith Metzger to come for a fun summer weekend. Well, this fun summer weekend never turned into a fun summer weekend because Jackson Pollock invited these 2 young women to go to the party of Alphonse Osorio, who was also a collector and an artist. And they never made it down the street. They crashed on Springs Fireplace Road, right here down the road, crashed into a tree. It was a convertible. The only survivor was Ruth Kligman, the mistress, who told the story. And apparently, there was Clifford Still waiting for his friend before the days of cell phones, right? And not even knowing what happened and reading about this later on in an obituary, okay? So Lee Krasner came in here after Pollock's death, and after 1 year, she resumed her creativity. And you can see her ghost marks here, we call them. This is where her paintings were. And you could see where her spills and splatters dripped. And like I said, she's an action painter. You see her here moving her whole entire body as she's painting. Now, the term action painter, that doesn't mean they're going crazy and just spinning around in some random movement. It was action painting, but it was also done very, very methodically, okay? And here, this photo shows a little history of the barn. They covered the floor with boards after, to renovate this barn studio. And after Lee Krasner died, the boards were taken off to reveal Jackson Pollock's drip painted floor. And here's a photo that shows the conservators in 1987 taking off those boards. Lee died in 1984. And that's why this floor only belongs to Jackson Pollock, okay? It's never been, what didn't have Lee Krasner's marks after that. So later on, if we have time, we'll take you into the house and show you the Picasso exhibit, and just as an add-on. But now I would like to get started with our guest speaker, Kendra Keenan. And I can't wait to learn about Clifford Still. And I'm so glad that people are on this Zoom road trip on this beautiful day. It just shows the level of interest in Clifford Still. So
lots of things to share with you all about Still, about the museum. I am happy to take questions and have this be more of a conversation as we go. The Clifford Still Museum is in Denver, Colorado, kind of right downtown near in the neighborhood that's called the Golden Triangle, just south of downtown. We are surrounded by the Denver Art Museum, all kinds of other buildings, and really kind of in a vibrant part of the neighborhood. Clifford Still, best known as an abstract expressionist painter for his large scale works like you see in one of the photos there. He did, those are his dates, 1904 to 1980. He grew up on his family's farm. So he lived mostly in Washington State and then in parts of Alberta, Canada, and kind of went back and forth between the two and was supposed to be a farmer. But he decides really early on that that is not what he wants to do, that he wants to be a painter. And he is encouraged by his mother, who was very creative and ran local book clubs. And he also learned to play the piano, almost went into music instead, and decides that the painting is what he wants to do. Does have the opportunity to go to college and learn about painting in Washington, and then ends up teaching as well. So this is an individual who's really interested in the world of art and seeks out knowledge and wants to know about who and what came before him. And we've got a few shots on the screen just from his life. You know, he starts painting early. There he is in the studio in high school, in the early 20s there at the top right. And then there's an image of him with his daughters there on the bottom right. One of the sort of myths of Still was that he was kind of this angry loner. But he was a pretty social guy. He loved baseball. He liked to talk to other artists, Pollock among them. He was really into just talking with other artists and finding out what everybody else was doing as well and exploring all of those ideas. Towards the end of his life, he does retreat a little bit. So he ends up in New York in the 60s. He meets Mark Rothko in San Francisco in the 50s. And Rothko is the person who said to Still, like, you've got to go to New York. So he moves to New York for a while, and he ends up being there kind of in that social scene and doing well. He'd been showing his work in San Francisco. He'd been showing in museums. He starts showing in galleries in New York. He's showing with Betty Parson, and decides that that is not what he wants to do either, and kind of pulls himself out of the commercial side of the art world and then retreats a little bit. So he spends kind of the rest of his days, the late 60s and the 70s, in Maryland, in rural Maryland, kind of goes full circle and ends up with a barn for a studio also, and painting in his barn, doing large scale works like you see on the screen here. That's one of his daughters, Sandra, standing next to a work. And one of the things that you can't quite get in a visit like this, that you get being in the museum, one of the many things, is that sense of scale of these works. And so I wanted to have at least a few images where you can see a person standing next to these to see how big some of these images are. And we exist as a museum because Still did feel so strongly. Oh, there's just a few more shots of him throughout his life as a child, with his car, with his daughters, painting. But we exist because Still felt really strongly about how you should look at art, specifically his art. And he thought that if you were going to understand an artist's work, that you should really just be looking at one artist's work. And so that, combined with how he felt about the commercial art world, which he thought was not supportive of artists and really was a game about making a thing to sell as opposed to making good art. So he pulls himself out of the commercial side right around 1951 and ends up keeping most of his art in his own possession. So when he dies, he has almost everything he made in his home in Maryland. He would just roll up the canvases and tubes and stick them in the living room. There weren't a lot of other places to see Still's work until our museum opened. And the timeline of the story and the way the museum opened, I think, are really interesting. Still leaves the whole collection in his will. He decides he's going to leave it all to one American city that will build a space for it, house it, share it, study it. And Denver gets really lucky to be chosen as that city. Now, he leaves it to Patricia. Patricia doesn't choose a city until 2004. Still dies in 1980. All of this art is just waiting and hanging out in their home and then in a warehouse until a city is chosen. And in that time, the collection is completely inaccessible. And what we're talking about, we have 95% of the work that's Still made in his career in our building now. It is about 830 paintings, about 2,300 works on paper, 3 sculptures that come out every now and then, and Still's entire personal archive. All of that sat completely inaccessible from 1980, when Still died, till we opened in 2011. So this is part of why it still gets a little bit forgotten about, as opposed to some of these other names that you tend to associate with abstract expressionism, even though he was really right in the middle of all of it, right at the beginning of all of it with Pollock and others. There was almost nowhere to look at his art, no new scholarship coming out. He did donate a few chunks. So you can see about 20, I think there's about 30 canvases in the SF MoMA in San Francisco, and about the same at the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo. And those were really the only other places where you could see chunks of his work. Other museums have like one, like the National Gallery, I think has one, LACMA has one. Yeah, so how did he support himself if he kept a lot of his work? I see that question in the chat. That's a great question. He did end up teaching a lot. So he was teaching painting at the college level. In fact, that's the only connection still has to Colorado at all, was that he came out and taught a painting class for CU Boulder the summer of 1960, which is another reason we feel really lucky to have the collection. We don't actually have a really direct connection to Still as a city or as a state. But Patricia, his widow, had a nephew that was living here in Denver, still lives here in Denver, and is on our board, Dr. Kurt Fried, and who was giving her some medical advice. This is the story our founding director would tell, that Dr. Fried was talking to his aunt, and Patricia says something like, well, what about Denver? And he says, that would be fantastic. He writes this proposal, and she promptly turns it down. My understanding is that it was considered to be too closely tied to the Denver Art Museum. And what Still really wanted was for this to be its own thing, not kind of part of this bigger collection of a museum where pieces get shown individually or kind of jumbled up. He wanted it to be all shown together. So lucky for us, Dr. Fried gets together with John Hickenlooper, who was our mayor at the time, writes a much more personal proposal to Patricia, really letting her know that this was the place that Still's art was going to be cared for and shared in the way that he had wanted. Hickenlooper ends up in Washington, D.C. for something unrelated, but takes the time to drive to Maryland to talk to Patricia in person to really relay that message. And lucky for us, she chooses Denver. And that was after turning down, I think, 19 or so other cities throughout the years. And she chooses Denver in 2004. And then she herself passes in 2005 and leaves a number of paintings to the collection as well. So the timing of that is what I always find kind of blows my mind, that all of this art just sat put away for all of these years and then is now accessible. The specific Maryland location, I do have that, and I'm forgetting about it at the moment, but we'll get that by the end, where in Maryland. Because there was a house until fairly recently. I think that was, the house is still there, but I don't think it's accessible anymore. Thank you, it is New Windsor. Yes. So we have this building that was designed specifically for this collection, which is another thing that we feel is really special and incredibly lucky. Our building is in the foreground there, just sort of the simple concrete. And the area we're in, again, is incredibly vibrant. We have the Denver Art Museum behind us, which is some of these angles we had designed by Daniel Liebeskind. The other part of the building is designed by Gio Ponti, kind of looks like a castle. In the background there, you have our main branch of the public library, designed by Michael Graves. The rest of the architecture surrounding the area is very sort of Greek and Roman. A lot of the city buildings are down there, the courthouse, we have a civic center park, the Capitol building, all of these are sort of very Greek and Roman inspired. So there's a lot going on in this space. And our architect, who from Allied Works Architecture, Brad Klopfel, decided that what this site really needed was a little bit of silence. So we have this building that is 2 stories, and it's just a square. Very focused on cast in place concrete, and with light coming more in from the ceiling, less from the sides. And it's just very simple. We are just a square. In fact, people have walked by us, not quite knowing who we were, thinking we were part of the Denver Art Museum. And that simplicity extends to the interior. This is one of the galleries inside. All of the art is upstairs, and we have a series of 9 square galleries. You just kind of walk through in a circle. You can walk either direction, but it does tend to have a path. We typically have 2 exhibits. The first one will be something that's more chronologically based, and then the second one tends to be a little more thematic. And you can see all just a little bit, again, the scale to see how big some of these works are. We have all kinds of groups into the building, students, adults, to interact with these very large works. Now, these are the kinds of works that Still was most well known for, but that is not how he started out. So we kind of go back to this Western upbringing, and Still starts out like many artists do, most artists, I might even say, kind of just painting what he sees around him. So we have cows and trains and open skies and grain silos and fields and things that he was just seeing in his everyday life. And these works are much smaller. Now this starts to change. 1930, summer of 1935, he gets to go to an artist retreat, Yaddo in upstate New York, where he spends a lot of time with other artists, not just painters, authors, poets, musicians. And this outward look that he has had on the world starts to shift a bit more inward. And he starts thinking about more human condition ideas. And we see things now with that shift and visually that are going to continue all the way through his work. And he starts making things that look more like this. And these. And we would call these sort of more transitional. They are not the realistic representational works that he started with, but we still have things that we could identify or pull out of these works, hands, machinery, things that link a little more directly to the real world still. That is going to shift again as Still starts to make works more like this. And this. And now we have these fully abstract works, just focused on line and shape and color. I want to take a few minutes and really just explore one of these works together. And this is where I'm going to ask you all for an opinion. So you either can show a hand or maybe put in the chat. I want to spend a few minutes with one of these, but I want to know which one you all want to look at. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 being the mostly blue one, 2 being sort of the brighter rainbowy colors, 3 is mostly red, 4 has the bright orange, and the 5 is the mostly black and white one. Which one would you all like to spend a few minutes looking at? 3 or 4.
I could help you out a little bit.
Yeah, let's see what we have. I
Definitely, I'm not 1, not 5.
No, I think we're at 2 or 3. Seem to be holding more.
Yeah, I had 3 or 4. Why don't you make the final decision?
Sounds good. And Sheila, did you have a question? Something you wanted to share?
I was choosing number 1.
Number 1. Okay. Thank you. It looks like we're somewhere between 2 and 3. So I think I'm going to go with 3, but if we have time, we'll come back. And I do just want to say about number 1, we very affectionately call that one Big Blue at the museum because it is so wide. It does not fit into our storage room downstairs. And so it is always on display somewhere. So if you make it out to Denver, you will be guaranteed to see that particular painting. All right, I'm going to switch tabs here so that I can show you this painting a little more closely. Our online collection is also available and is great for exploring works in more detail. All right, here, there we go. Can you all see the painting? Wonderful. So I want to take a moment and just look. What are we noticing so far? Anything at all? You can type this in the chat, you can unmute yourself, whatever you're comfortable with.
I think the colors are very stark, deep.
Stark and deep. I'm seeing it might look like birds flying away from a fire, noticing the green, movement almost collapsing into itself. A lot of people are noticing this movement around the canvas. To me, it's almost like a swirl. Red, lots of red, absolutely. So think about these colors just for a moment. What do these colors make us think about or feel?
Almost anger.
Anger for some of us, heat, energy, chaos,
Fire.
fire, autumn, calm, heat within, right? So we might have a variety of things. Vibrant, for some of us, it's maybe a little angrier, a little more chaotic. Others are thinking more of the warmth, vibrancy and energy, which could go either way. This painting, like I will never think about this painting the same way after a group of fifth graders came in. And it's a little hard to see, but right in here, there's this tiny little bit like yellow and green right there. And this 10-year-old told me that that was the place where you fell through. And so that was where you fell through. That was way above you and you were falling and swirling and falling all the way back. So that's what I always think about when I see this painting. Now we all were seeing a variety of things, all kinds of different things. We are not needing to see the same thing. And I did not give you a title or put up a title because there isn't one. Clifford Still's not the kind of artist to tell you what you're supposed to think about his work, or even what he thought about his work, really. But a lot of abstract artists will still give you some sort of clue in a title, in an artist statement, something. And here we don't have those clues. So when you walk in and see a painting like this with nothing to tell you what you're supposed to think or feel about it, what do you get to think or feel about it? Anything you want. So it can be, yes, exactly, whatever you want. And so it can be a little confusing sometimes. It can be a little frustrating, but I think that's also what is amazing about this work, because it means whatever connections you're making today, whatever thoughts and feelings you're having, whatever ideas, you've got it. And if you have an entirely different interaction with this painting another day, or if you're having an entirely different reaction than the person with you looking at it, you still got it. And that's the part that I think is pretty fantastic. That's not often that we get to have that experience, I think, in a world that is often looking for the right answer. So we have all these different things that we could be thinking or feeling when we look at this art, thinking about the colors and the shapes and the lines and whatever that brings up for us. Now, Still did not think of himself as an action painter at all. In fact, very specifically said he was not an action painter, but that each painting was an act itself. Now, what he does have in common with Pollock and most of the other artists that we would categorize as abstract expressionist artists was a slightly different method. So Still is not using a paintbrush either. He's using a palette knife for the vast majority of his painting. Lots of different sizes, lots of different shapes. So while he's not an action painter, there is a physicality to doing a painting like this. He's got them vertical. He's getting up on a ladder. And think about how your hand feels when you hold a paintbrush and how that might move, how your wrist might move and the textures you might create. And then think about holding the end of a palette knife and the push and the pull and the scrape you get. And so we get all of these really thick textures and these distinct edges and these marks here. So when you start thinking about like what makes a still, that's one of the things that you would start noticing. What else are we seeing here? Or if you were going to give it a title, what would you call it? Is the white the canvas or paint? So you've got a little bit of both. Still starts to play with blank canvas a lot. So all of this tan through here is blank canvas. There are times when he layers on a little bit of white, I think more in other paintings than this one, but sometimes you do get like a little bit of like white paint as well. But most of those bits you're seeing are blank canvas. Noticing these bursts of yellow. I think bursts is a great word. And this is another thing that I think is very typical of Still, where you have these little bits of a color, these bursts of yellow, or this bit of green, or this tiny little bit that sort of adds a lot of balance, kind of pulls the whole thing together. Emotions, maybe lots of different emotions. Oh, for a title, we've got Flying Embers. I love asking that question because it gives us so many different ways to look at this painting. And no matter how many times I look at a work, and I've looked at this one a lot, I get new ideas on how to look at it every time I get to look with a new group. And Still himself really wouldn't explain. There's a story of a critic asking him at a museum show, Mr. Still, what are these shapes and colors all about? And he flipped it back the way I have been today and said, well, what do you see? And the critic had some big story. I don't know exactly what it was. It was an emotion, a cityscape, a landscape, something. And he tells Still this whole interpretation he has. And all Clifford Still says is, well, that tells me a lot about you. And then he walks away. And even his daughter, Sandra, who is on our board and has been to the museum as well, said she would ask him, Dad, what's this one about? And she said he would just give her the look. He wouldn't explain anything to her either, which I think must have been kind of a hard place to be. Sandra tells another story of Still waking up in the middle of the night at her apartment in New York while he's visiting and being very agitated. And he says, nobody understands, I should just burn them all. And she's a little upset at this point. She's fine, Dad, they're your paintings, go ahead. And lucky for all of us, he did not do that. But to me, that says that there must have been quite a pull with wanting to explain, but wanting people to have their own experiences, because that is part of this art. Like, we don't have art about things anymore. We have art about ideas. And even though Still isn't telling us exactly what this one's about or what he was thinking and feeling, we do know a bit about what kind of ideas he's exploring. And this is post World War II, where he and a number of other artists are really thinking about how you relate to art after this big event, and how do you be creative. And you have a lot of artists starting to explore these big ideas big universal ideas, things we all experience, no matter how we grow up, where we live, how much money we have, big ideas like life, death, change, growth. So those are the types of things we know he's exploring. We just don't know which one he was thinking about here. So the question of, did he sketch his concepts before committing to canvas, or were these spontaneous bursts of energy? Sort of both. He is definitely an artist who plans. He is not typically what you would think of as the spontaneous, I'm just going to go to the canvas and paint. We do have canvases that have pencil marks around some of the edges, and we know he was planning certain shapes. We also have all of these works on paper, but they're not really like sketches for a painting typically. He did do that a little earlier on, but even then he would almost use words more than a true sketch, and would like write out things that he had seen outside and then would take it back in and make a painting that way. But his works on paper are almost more of a visual diary, where you see him exploring ideas on paper, exploring ideas on canvas. Sometimes they go back and forth, but he didn't typically sketch to create the painting. But he's also doing a lot of planning and thinking with the painting, as opposed to just being spontaneous. So there's a little bit of both there. It does not appear to have many paint globs as one sees in Van Gogh. Oh, it's interesting. Not the same kind of thickness, but there are places, I think, where you do get to see quite the buildup of texture with these moments. But you're right, it's not typically as globbed up, although Still was very aware of Van Gogh, and that was an artist that he had studied. There's even some thought that as to why Clifford signs his paintings just Clifford, not Still. So did Vincent van Gogh would just sign them Vincent. And so there's the thought that maybe it's that influence. It could also be that he wanted to distance himself from his father and the farm life that he was supposed to have. So there's a few different ideas there. Still, again, is not the kind of artist to give us a lot of information. He leaves a lot of stuff. We have journals and many writings that he did about art. They're just not very specific about his own art. What else are we wondering about? Whether it's this painting, Still, the museum? Do we want to take a look at one more? Or Joyce, do we want to just open up for questions in general?
I think it would be great. Can you discuss that blue one or one of the other ones?
Absolutely. All right, I see one more from a few places.
Didn't he do a lot in blue?
We do see, yes, actually, we do see a fair amount of blue. Let me get back to this other one here. And then this idea of whether he flip them around, because the question always does come up, how do we know it's the right direction? I don't know that he did a lot of flipping around. He did typically sign them somewhere. And so we usually have a clue as to which way it's supposed to go. Or we have sketches or photographs. He would take photographs. So like we don't have titles, but we have numbers. Like this is PH 247. That's not a chronological number. That just means it's the 247th photograph he took of a painting. But he didn't necessarily do them in chronological order. So, but there are a couple that we have had to make educated guesses on. And there is a painting that was hung in the museum one way and then has been hung the other way because then we think that it was meant to be the second direction. So that has happened. And we do encourage people to sort of tilt and see some of the different ways that you might explore these works. Did he address why he seemed to prefer larger canvases? Not specifically. There's two things I think are primarily at play here. One, as his work becomes more and more abstract, he starts exploring larger and larger scales. I think he also has more accessibility to these larger canvases as well. He starts out as a graduate student and a professor painting smaller because canvas wasn't super cheap. So when he goes to the artist retreat in the summer of 35, he has to bring his own materials. So he brings a roll or like a roll of window shade, like the pull down window shade, and he just cut squares out of it all summer long because that was the material he could afford. So I think the combination of access and I think it also fit better as he was becoming more abstract with the ideas, these big ideas that he wanted to explore, I think he thought needed bigger spaces. So now we have Big Blue, which again, not a title, just our affectionate nickname. What are we noticing here? Why did we want to look at this one?
I just love the color. This is Joyce. It's an aesthetic reaction. And I think the color it does remind me of Van Gogh and the French painters and Monet and France. It reminds me of France.
Interesting.
It's just,
yeah, I see that. Like Laura's kind of a great, so much blue. It is so much blue. I think about just how much paint it took to cover this canvas. And if I could give you like a sense of scale here, I'm thinking about like a typical ceiling height in a home. This is taller than that. Like there is not a wall in my home that I could put this painting on. And these lines, this thin line that we have through here, that in person is a little more orange, but definitely has kind of a blend of yellows and oranges. This is actually one of the few things that Still does talk about. And he called these long, thin lines lifelines. And it goes back to this idea of when we are upright, we are alive. When animals and plants are upright, they are alive. And we actually have very few horizontal lines through Still's art, especially the further in he gets. And some of these lines might even go all the way back. He does a lot of trains early on where you have a long, thin line of smoke coming up through the sky. And so we see some of these aesthetics all the way through. We also, again, have some blank canvas. This whole strip down the side is just blank. So what do we think of all this blue? Do we love it? Is it calming? Is it energizing? Reminds you of Frankenthaler, Kirsten, kind of that big field. Beautiful, we like it. What are we noticing? What are we thinking? What are we feeling? It's calming. Does anyone get a different feeling? Oh, divided. Amy, would you say more about that?
Sure. Thank you so much for exposing us. I was not familiar with him, just as a preface. Well, the energy, I'm trying to think, it's not in the middle. It's to the, it's off center. And there's this large line and then this thin line. So, given the fact that we all bring wherever we are in the moment to a picture, I can't say much more than it intrigues me. And And I wonder what he was thinking and what he was trying to tell us.
Always. I always wonder, what was he thinking with this one? What was that big idea? I can tell you whatever the big idea was with this one, he explored it in a variety of ways. He did this one in 1951, and he did 3 other canvases that are incredibly similar to this composition, but with other colors. We have one that's almost all black, one that's almost all red, and one that's almost all blank canvas, all from 1951. And yeah, Laura, it kind of looks like a road seen from above. You kind of get that landscape element that looking down on it. Absolutely. I thought of that too. Sheila, what are you thinking?
That it's a whole Merrick. The atmosphere is very tumultuous, very beautiful, and I think that the lines actually stabilize the canvas, and you might even think that there's a little feeling of the zips that artists of his time and a little later started doing.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I find really interesting. Tumultuous. What a great word to kind of be thinking about this texture and all that. And zips. Barnett Newman did a very similar painting the very same year, almost all blue with the line down. And if you ask Still or Newman, they would both say they did it first.
Yeah.
So they're all talking to each other, and they're all making things, or none of them are working in a vacuum. So I do find it really interesting to see what kind of travels back and forth. I feel like traveling between rock walls or tall buildings. Yeah, Kirsten, almost like we're going between something.
There's an energy that's created, a different energy between the solidity and the straightness of the 2 lines and the more fluid blacks that are interspersed throughout the work, which I think is a great contrast.
These textures. Black is also one of the only other things that Still talks a little bit about. Now, what do we tend to associate with the color black? And I say we is like a general Western American perspective. What do we tend to associate black with? Death. Right? Death, darkness, depression, maybe the night sky, shadows. Absolutely. It's not usually terribly positive. Still thought of black as a warm, generative color. Yeah, and evil. But he thought of it really differently. It's this warm, generative color that I think we see in the way he uses black. He doesn't tend to have the shinier, cooler blacks. They're very matte, they're very warm, they're very velvety. Still also like to mix his own paint. So he is very in control of how shiny, how matte, how thick, how thin, and gets to kind of play with that. He thought of it as a responsibility for your materials and understanding how to use them. Yeah, Laura Rhodes. I like that connection and the contrast. Anything else we're thinking about, wondering? Yes, Dorothea, we do have a documentary came out a couple years ago on Still. So if you're interested in knowing more, that documentary is a great place to start. We also have a number of videos on our own YouTube page, and I can put in a moment, I'll put the museum website in the chat. I would definitely check out the website, the YouTube page. There are all kinds of different things about the work there.
I'm also intrigued. The thin line is like letting the light in.
Almost like a crack.
Right.
A little bit. Do the similar paintings. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just saying it looks like a crack to me too.
I like that idea of the crack. I've had some people talk. Yeah, almost like maybe there's a door that's going to open, or a crack in a wall, or a parting of curtains, that there's something there, someplace you could go, which I always find really interesting, because one of the things about abstract expressionism and art of this scale, this isn't art you're supposed to just look at. This is art you're supposed to engage with, have an experience with, have an interaction with. And when works like this were originally hung, they were floor to ceiling, and they might be kind of near each other. So it was kind of meant to overwhelm. When you're standing in front of it, it's so big that if you're close enough, it's all you see. It's almost like you could be right in it.
Sort of makes me think of the Leonard Cohen song about the broken, where something's broken, it lets the light in.
I love the connection to music too. So do the similar paintings of his that you mentioned all have the wide and thin lines in them? Mostly, yes. They don't all have them to the same degree, but they all have some sort of vertical line going through them. His alternate path, that's a really interesting idea, that maybe the wide line is the general population's life and that the other line is maybe his path, maybe kind of going along but not quite together. And Beth, you're seeing a waterfall. Yeah, with that blue, it's almost like it's cascading down over something. Yes, there are 3 others. There's one that's almost all red, one that's mostly blank canvas, and one that's mostly black. And that's one, if you're interested in looking at those paintings in particular, when you go, you can go to the online collection. I can actually show you. Our online collection on the website, you can actually search by color. So if you just wanted to see ones that were red or that focused on red, you could do that. And then you could also narrow it down if you only wanted to look at paintings as opposed to drawings. You could do that. And then you could decide if you only wanted things that were abstract, you could search that way. So there are a lot of different ways to search through the collection and see the variety. I mean, we have looked at the tiniest sliver of Clifford Still's work today. We have not even come close to showing all of the work that we have. Stop sharing. It was actually a really exciting thing. It was just a few years ago that we finally saw everything that we have in the collection. We had been slowly unrolling and restretching and assessing paintings as we went, and then realized that we really just needed to see everything. So it was just a couple of years ago that we did sort of our final unrolling. It was really exciting. It was really fun. We actually had some of our education team were in 5th grade classrooms around the city, typing questions to our conservators, our director live as they were unrolling these last paintings. We unrolled everything and then of course had to re-roll some of them right back up until we can have time to properly assess and restretch. But we didn't even see everything until about 2 years ago. And every exhibit we do can hold maybe 70 or 80 canvases typically out of the 830 or so that we have. So there's a lot still to discover with this collection. It's been really exciting. Is there anything else I can answer that we're wondering about?
Can you talk a little about the extensive archives with all the letters and everything?
Yes. So in addition to all of this art, we have Still's entire personal archive. We have letters he wrote, books he read, music he listened to, art supplies. And so we have an archival hallway in the museum as well that houses many of these things. And you can read the letters he wrote to people. We have the letter that he wrote to Betty Parson when he pulled himself out of the commercial world, basically saying, I know you're getting ready to do your next cycle like of scheduling. And thank you very much. I will not be participating. So we have like that letter that he put out there. We have supplies he was using. It always makes me kind of laugh that even Clifford Still had a box of Crayola crayons in his supplies and would sometimes just, and most of his drawings are just oil pastel on construction paper. And he liked to play with color in that way. So we get to take this really deep dive. I think we have the luxury of taking this really deep dive into this artist through his things, through his art. We have journals that he wrote that we're still going through. And seeing exactly what is all in there. Many photographs by him that he took, that his daughter took, all kinds of things to continue to explore that can help us understand this artist a little better. Joyce, was there something else about the archives you wanted to talk more about, or just the general?
No, I was just wondering, and did you discuss at all the letter that he wrote to Pollock or vice versa that you have in the archives? Did you?
Well, the letter, it turns out it's really more of this conversation that is documented, and that he was talking about it in an interview as opposed to the letter, and that it was him talking directly to Pollock. Okay. And then talking about it in this interview. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, does anybody have one last closing remark or question for Kendra?
It's just wonderful to be exposed to this work. So thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you all for being here today and for letting me come and chat with you all. It was a wonderful way to spend some time. I did just put, or here, let me put this in the chat, the website, if anyone's interested in checking out a little more. I'm also going to put my email there if anyone has any other questions about the museum or finds himself out here and wants to know more. Please feel free to reach out. It's always great to make some new connections and talk to some more people about this, what I think is a pretty amazing collection. And what I love especially about it, just to leave you with this thought, is that it's so open. Like a lot of the programs we do, yes, they're about Clifford Still, but they're really more about access to art and entering the world of abstract art. Because this collection is so open to interpretation, it's actually less about Still's view sometimes and more about what connections we make and what stories we can tell and what other voices we can be amplifying while using this collection as that entry point, as that lens. So thank you all for letting me be here with you today. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thanks for being here.
Kendra, I really, this is Joyce. I want to say my biggest thank you, and I know so many positive comments are coming through, and you are a true educator.
Oh, thank you.
On this, and I know other people feel the same way, you actually opened up the world of Clifford Still and abstract art on a small computer screen. We can imagine what it would be like there standing in front of them. And just by your questioning and the comments that everybody said, it really creates an understanding. Typically, studies show people look at a painting for 4 seconds when they go to a museum. And you really slowed us down, so we had really time to look and wonder and imagine. And I'm going to, now I have to go to Colorado. So we're going to have
Come
all
see
the
us.
New Yorkers are going to be knocking at your door, okay?
Fantastic. Let's go look at some art in person. It'd be amazing.
Yeah, and you're always welcome to come here and visit the Pollock House if you're ever in the area. And, thank you so much. So visit the website. That's, what is it, Kendra?
It's just cliffordstillmuseum.org, or if you just search Clifford Still Museum, we're really all that's going to pop up.
Great. And our website is pkhouse.org. And we do have some special programs in October. We are going to be celebrating Lee Krasner's birthday with firsthand accounts of people who knew Lee. And we're also going to have a hands-on workshop where we're going to paint autumn. So maybe we will, in the form of abstract art. So maybe we'll combine some of these ideas about painting. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you again to Kendra, and everybody have a wonderful day.